She spent 9 years building an empire she was never allowed to own. Tonight, her husband replaced her with a woman who can barely spell the word investment, and he did it in front of every man who feared him. But what Damian Moretti doesn't know yet is this. Every account, every contract, every financial lifeline keeping his empire breathing has one name on it. Hers. Watch this story until the very end and drop a like, then comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far Isabella's story has traveled. The dinner had been set for 7 o'clock, and by 6:55, every seat around the long mahogany table inside the Moretti Estate's main hall was filled. Capos, underbosses, family attorneys, senior advisors whose loyalty had been purchased across 3 decades and whose silence had been maintained through a combination of money and carefully applied fear. They sat with their wives, with their expensive suits, with their practiced expressions of calm. Men who had learned long ago that emotion at a Moretti gathering was a liability. Isabella moved through the kitchen corridor with the controlled efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times, because she had. She checked the wine temperature herself. She confirmed the seating arrangements with the estate manager, a nervous man named Ricci, who'd been with the household for 11 years and still sweated through his collar every time she walked past. She had pulled the floral centerpieces 2 inches toward the center of the table because the proportion was wrong, and proportion mattered, not because guests would consciously notice, but because perfection communicated authority, and authority was the only language anyone in that room actually respected. She was 41 years old. Her dark hair was pulled back with the kind of simplicity that costs more than most people made in a month. She wore no jewelry except a single bracelet, platinum, unadorned, a gift she'd bought herself 3 years ago on a morning when she'd closed a refinancing deal that saved the Moretti shipping division from federal seizure. Damian hadn't known about that deal until a week after it was done. He'd nodded when she explained it and gone back to his phone. That was the shape of their marriage. She didn't think about it the way other women might. She had trained herself out of that kind of thinking years ago, around the time she understood that the man she had married was fundamentally incapable of seeing past what stood directly in front of him. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was a specific kind of blindness that powerful men developed when everyone around them reflexively agreed with everything they said. Damian Moretti had been told he was exceptional since he was 19 years old. After enough years of that, a man stopped questioning the narrative. Isabella had stopped waiting for him to see her clearly sometime around year 4. She had kept working anyway. She pushed through the side door into the main hall and did a final scan of the room. Table settings, lighting, the placement of the 2 discreet security personnel she'd positioned near the east corridor after receiving an intelligence report last Tuesday, suggesting that the Calderon family had placed an informant somewhere inside the estate catering staff. She'd handled that quietly, replacing the external catering crew with a vetted internal team 24 hours before the event. She hadn't told Damian because telling Damian would have meant an explosion, a confrontation, and probably 3 days of chaos that would have drawn exactly the kind of attention she was trying to prevent. She managed by containment. She always had. Ricci appeared at her elbow. "Mrs. Moretti, Mr. Moretti has just arrived at the gate." A pause. "He's brought a guest." Isabella looked at him. Ricci was staring at the floor. "Who?" she said. Not a question, exactly. More like a confirmation she was already calculating around. "A woman, ma'am. Miss DeLuca. Bianca DeLuca." He swallowed. He called ahead and asked that a place setting be added to the head of the table. Isabella was quiet for 4 full seconds. She could feel the blood moving through her jaw. She unclenched it deliberately. "Add the setting," she said. "Put it to his left." He specified to his left, Ricci. He moved immediately. She walked to her own chair, which was at the opposite end of the table from Damian's, a positioning they'd settled into years ago that had started as practical and calcified into something that said more than either of them had ever explicitly acknowledged. She sat. She lifted her water glass. Her hand was completely steady. She heard the main doors open before she saw him. Damian Moretti was 53, built like a man who had been physically imposing in his 30s and had since allowed comfort to soften the edges without eliminating the underlying architecture of intimidation. He moved through a room the way weather moved, not asking permission, not adjusting for the people already in it. He was laughing at something when he entered, that wide, performative laugh he used in public, the one that never reached the back of his eyes. Beside him was Bianca De Luca. Isabella had known the name for approximately 4 months, a socialite from a minor family with money but no power, known primarily for appearing at charity events and cultivating a social media presence that performed wealth with the slightly too eager quality of someone who had grown up adjacent to money rather than inside it. She was 31. She was extremely beautiful in the way that required significant maintenance and good lighting. She wore a dress that had been selected to communicate arrival, deep red, structured at the shoulders, the kind of garment worn by someone who wanted to be looked at by everyone in a room simultaneously. She was holding Damien's arm with both hands. Every conversation in the room paused. Not obviously, these were men trained to absorb shock without showing it. But Isabella felt the pause the way she felt most things in that room, as a vibration in the air pressure. Luciana Moretti, seated 3 chairs to Isabella's right, made no effort to hide her satisfaction. Damien's mother was 71, narrow-faced, with eyes that were permanently calculating something at a distance. She had disliked Isabella since the beginning, not because of anything Isabella had done, but because of the specific threat that a competent woman poses to a woman whose entire identity is constructed around her son's supremacy. Luciana had spent 9 years quietly insisting to anyone who would listen that Isabella's contributions to the family were ornamental. She believed it completely because she had never once asked what Isabella actually did. Damien settled into his chair at the head of the table. Bianca was redirected, by one of his handlers, not by him, to the left position. She sat with the practiced ease of a woman who had rehearsed exactly this moment. Then Damien raised his glass. Isabella watched him do it. She had spent 9 years reading him, which meant she could tell when he had decided something before he opened his mouth. There was a particular quality to his stillness in those moments, a held breath that wasn't quite confidence, more like the split second before a man jumps off a ledge he's already committed to. "I want to say something," Damien said, "to everyone in this room." The conversations that had resumed after his entrance stopped again, fully this time. "Family isn't just blood," he said. "It's about who belongs beside you, who reflects who you are." He looked at Bianca, and the look was unambiguous. "I've spent a long time figuring out who that person is for me, and I think it's time everyone here understood where things stand." He didn't look at Isabella once. He didn't need to. Every other person at the table did it for him. That collective, involuntary shift of eyes toward the far end of the mahogany, toward the woman sitting with her spine perfectly straight and her water glass still raised exactly halfway to her lips. Isabella set the glass down. She picked up her linen napkin from her lap. She folded it along its original crease, carefully, the way she did everything, with the compressed precision of someone who had learned early that how you handled small things was the only thing you actually controlled. She placed it beside her untouched plate. She stood. No one spoke. Not Luciana, who looked almost triumphant. Not the capos, who were watching with the careful attention of men calculating consequences in real time. Not Bianca, who had the decency, at least, to drop her eyes. Isabella walked out of the room. Not fast, not slow. No trembling lip, no redirected gaze, no backward glance at the man who had just used a dinner table full of witnesses to end 23 years of her life without once saying her name. The corridor outside the main hall was cool and dim. The sound of the gathering faded behind the closed doors. Isabella walked to the far end of the corridor, to the small study she used when she worked from the estate, which was frequently. She sat in the chair behind the desk. She put both hands flat on the surface. Her breath was measured. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. A technique she'd learned in her 20s during a period she didn't talk about, when measured breathing was the only thing she had been able to control reliably. She opened the top left drawer of the desk. Inside was a manila envelope she'd prepared 18 months ago, when she first understood, not suspected, understood, with the quiet certainty of a woman who processes evidence rather than emotions, that the marriage was moving toward a conclusion. She had not known what form that conclusion would take. She had prepared for several possibilities. She picked up the envelope. She set it on the desk in front of her. Then she opened the door of the study, walked back to the main hall entrance, and gave the envelope to Ricci, who was standing in the corridor with the expression of a man who had witnessed something he was going to be processing for years. "Put that beside my plate," she said. "Then bring the car around to the east entrance." "Mrs. Moretti, the car, Ricci?" She went back to the study and made a phone call. The man who answered was named Henrik Voss. He was the senior executive director of a private international banking institution whose name appeared on no public documentation and whose involvement in the Moretti organization's legitimate financial infrastructure had been arranged, structured, and maintained entirely by Isabella over a period of 6 years. His voice, when he answered, carried the unhurried precision of a man accustomed to conversations worth enormous amounts of money. "Isabella," he said, "I was expecting your call this week." "I'm not going to be able to sign the restructuring documents tonight," she said. A pause. "I see. May I ask—" "I'll explain when I see you. I need the convoy at the East Gate in 20 minutes. "Of course." Another pause, briefer. "Will you be coming alone?" "Yes," she said. "I'll be coming alone." She ended the call. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the study. The hum of the climate system, the faint sound of voices from the main hall beginning to reconstruct themselves into something resembling normal conversation, the distant sound of a car navigating the estate's gravel approach. She thought about the envelope she'd left on the table. She thought about what was inside it. She thought about the particular quality of Damien's voice when he'd said "who reflects who you are," the self-satisfaction in it, the complete absence of any awareness that he was in the process of pulling the single thread that the entire architecture of his empire was suspended from. She didn't feel grief, exactly. That surprised her, and then it didn't. She thought she had probably done most of the grieving already, in those quiet years of understanding without acknowledgement, of working in the dark for a man who was completely comfortable letting her stay there. What she felt, sitting in that study with the envelope gone and the phone back in her pocket, was something closer to the particular clarity that follows a decision that has been made. Not impulsively, not emotionally, but the way important decisions are actually made. Slowly, over time, by the accumulation of 1,000 smaller understandings that eventually reach a weight no single moment can bear alone. She was ready. She picked up her coat from the hook behind the study door. She walked down the east corridor without turning on the lights. She knew the layout of the estate the way she knew everything she needed to know. Precisely, completely, from memory. She pushed open the east door. Outside, the night air hit her face, cold and clean. The estate grounds stretched in every direction, under a sky crowded with stars that the lights of the city barely reached out here. Ricci was already there, holding the door of the car with the expression of a man honoring a formality he understood the weight of. She got in. Inside the main hall, she knew without needing to be present, the envelope had been opened. She knew the expressions that would be on the faces of the people reading the documents inside. The banking agreements, the offshore trust instruments, the letters of guarantee bearing her signature and hers alone, the 11-page ledger she'd compiled documenting exactly which arms of the Moretti organization would collapse first, and in what sequence if she declined to authorize the restructuring. She didn't need to see it. Back in the main hall, Luciana Moretti had gone completely still. The document in her hands was a guarantee letter, 8 pages, carrying the letterhead of a private bank none of the capos present could name, which was precisely the point, because legitimacy in the Moretti Empire's financial infrastructure had always operated in the spaces between what people knew and what they had never thought to ask. The signature at the bottom was Isabella's. The authority it represented was absolute. Damien was reading a different page. His face had moved through several expressions since the envelope had been passed around the table. Confusion, dismissal, and now something that looked like the beginning of a reckoning that was going to take him a long time to arrive at fully. Bianca De Luca sat with her hands in her lap and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and she was intelligent enough to understand, at least in this moment, that the room had left her behind. One of the capos, a man named Ferrano, who ran the Northeastern Logistics Division and had been with the family for 20 years, put his documents down very carefully and looked at the empty chair at the far end of the table. "Where is she?" he said. No one answered. Through the east gate of the Moretti estate, 3 armored vehicles moved in a quiet convoy along the private road. In the rear vehicle, Isabella sat with her coat folded across her lap and her phone dark on the seat beside her. Henrik Voss had sent a message. "We can be ready in 2 hours." She had sent one back. "I'm not signing tonight." The convoy passed through the gate and turned onto the main road. The estate lights receded behind the tinted glass. Isabella did not look back. In the distance, a phone was already ringing, Damien's, she assumed, or perhaps one of the senior attorneys who had just understood, fully and catastrophically, what the absence of one woman from a dinner table actually meant for the continued existence of everything they had spent their careers protecting. She let it ring. And somewhere behind her, inside the mahogany-paneled room, where the Moretti Empire had always been governed by the assumption that power and fear were sufficient foundations for anything, the silence that had followed Isabella Vaughn out the door was finally, irrevocably, beginning to collapse into something that would not be quiet for very long. The phone on Damien Moretti's side of the table had rung 4 times before he picked it up, and the conversation that followed lasted less than 90 seconds, which was enough time for the color to leave his face in a way that none of the men seated around that mahogany table had ever witnessed in 20 years of watching him absorb bad news. He set the phone down. He didn't speak immediately. That was unusual. Damien Moretti was a man who filled silences the way water filled containers, automatically, completely, without apparent effort. The silence he left now had a different quality. It had weight. Ferrano was still watching him from across the table. The ledger pages from Isabella's envelope were spread in front of several of the capos now, passed hand to hand with the careful movements of men handling something they didn't fully understand but recognized as dangerous. Bianca De Luca had not moved from her chair. She had the particular stillness of a person who has realized, too late, that they have walked into a room where nothing about the conversation has anything to do with them. "Someone get me Castellano," Damien said finally. Castellano was the family's senior financial attorney. He was seated 3 chairs down, and he was already pale. "I've been reading the guarantee documents," Castellano said carefully. "Damien, these are... The bank on these letters is the Voss Private Group. I've never heard that name in connection with our accounts." "I know the name." "You know it." "I know she dealt with them." A pause. "I didn't know the scope?" Castellano put the pages down very slowly. "The scope," he repeated, "is that every legitimate business arm we operate, the shipping division, the commercial real estate holdings, the medical supply distribution contracts, the 3 construction companies in New Jersey, every one of them carries a financing structure that runs through instruments that Isabella personally guaranteed. Not the family, her. If she withdraws authorization, she's not going to withdraw authorization." The room let that sentence breathe for a moment. Ferrano leaned forward. He was a large man, deliberate in his movements, the kind of person who had survived 20 years in a violent organization by being extremely careful about which problems he decided to speak out loud. "Damien," he said, "she already left. She'll come back. She took a convoy of armored vehicles from our east gate, and she left a document on the table that is telling us, in very precise legal language, that she is the single point of authorization for $4 billion worth of financial infrastructure." Ferrano's voice was level. "That is not the behavior of a woman who is coming back because we ask nicely." Luciana Moretti had not spoken since she'd read her document. She sat with the papers folded in her lap and her expression arranged in the careful blankness of someone recalibrating. The satisfaction she'd worn when Damien walked in with Bianca had not simply disappeared. It had been replaced by something more complicated and considerably less comfortable. She was a woman who had spent 71 years being right about things, and the specific sensation of being catastrophically wrong was one she did not have much practice managing. "This is theater," she said finally. "She's making a point. She'll be back within the week." "Mama," Damien's voice had an edge. "She has always been theatrical, even when she was quiet about it. This is the same impulse dressed up in paperwork." "The bank called," Damien said. "Henrik Voss himself. He called this table. He said Isabella has suspended her authorization pending, and I'm using his exact words here, a restructuring of her personal involvement in the Moretti financial portfolio." He looked at his mother. He also said that without her signature on the restructuring documents by the end of the month, The existing guarantee structures enter automatic review, which triggers a cross-default clause in the commercial real estate financing that could initiate seizure proceedings on 6 properties. Luciana was quiet. 6 properties, Mama. That's not theater. The dinner had gone cold. No one was eating. One of the wives at the far end of the table had quietly taken her children from the room 20 minutes ago, reading the atmosphere with the accuracy that people develop when they live adjacent to dangerous men, and survival depends on knowing when to disappear. Bianca finally moved. She reached for her wine glass, thought better of it, and set her hand back in her lap. She looked at Damien. "Should I?" "Stay where you are," he said, without looking at her. She stayed. Castellano gathered the documents into a rough pile in front of him, the movements of a man assembling a problem he was going to be living inside for the foreseeable future. "We need to find her tonight," he said. "Not tomorrow, tonight, before any of this has the chance to develop into something the wrong people start paying attention to." "The wrong people," Ferrano said flatly, "are already paying attention. The Calderon family has had a man near our estate for 3 weeks. If they've seen any of this—" "They haven't seen anything," Damien said. "They saw 3 armored vehicles leave your east gate during a family dinner. They don't need to know the details to start drawing conclusions." The room had changed its quality entirely from the gathering it had been an hour ago. The capos who had arrived expecting food and ceremony were now conducting a crisis session with no preparation and incomplete information, which was the exact kind of environment where men with too much pride and too little patience made decisions they couldn't walk back. Damien felt it. The particular pressure of a room full of people who were frightened and trying not to show it, which was always more dangerous than a room full of people who were simply angry. He stood up. "Everyone who isn't Ferrano, Castellano, or family leaves this room now." The evacuation was efficient. Years of operating in a structure where Damien's instructions were followed without hesitation had produced a reflexive compliance that served him well in this moment, at least. The capos filed out. Their wives followed. Bianca stood. "You too," Damien said. She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not quite hurt, more like a recalibration of expectations. She picked up her clutch from the table and walked out without speaking. When the doors closed, it was just Damien, his mother, Ferrano, and Castellano. And the envelope. Ferrano picked up the ledger pages again. He read for a moment in silence. "There's a line in here," he said. "Page 9. She lists the Voss restructuring as a 12-month process that she began coordinating last October." He looked up. "October, she started building the exit architecture a year ago." "She didn't know this was going to happen a year ago," Luciana said. "No," Ferrano agreed, "but she apparently understood it was possible." He set the pages down. "That is a different kind of woman than the one you've been describing to me for 9 years. Luciana's jaw tightened. "Watch how you speak." "I'm not speaking to you," Ferrano said. "I'm speaking to the man who needs to understand what he's actually dealing with before he makes another decision based on a picture that isn't accurate." Damien's hand was flat on the table. His knuckles were white. Not from anger exactly, more from the physical effort of containing the specific humiliation of being the last person in the room to fully understand something that apparently everyone else was now reading in real time from documents his wife had placed at his dinner table on her way out the door. "Find her," he said. "We know approximately where she's going," Castellano said. "Voss Group maintains a private suite at the Alderton on 52nd. She's used it before for meetings." "Then go there." "And say what exactly?" The question sat in the room. Damien didn't answer it immediately, which was its own kind of answer. The Alderton was 40 minutes from the estate by car, and the man Damien sent was not Ferrano or Castellano, but a younger underboss named Marco Sette. Quick, presentable, disciplined enough to deliver a message without improvising around it. He arrived at the hotel at 11:47 and was escorted by the concierge, following a call from the Moretti organization's long-standing account manager at the property to the 4th-floor executive suite. He knocked. The door was opened not by Isabella, but by a tall man with silver hair and the kind of unreadable composure that comes from spending a career managing other people's catastrophic financial decisions. Henrik Voss looked at Marco the way a surgeon looks at a paper cut, aware of it, unimpressed by it. Mr. Set, Voss said, I was told to expect someone. I wasn't told who. I'm here to speak with Mrs. Moretti. Ms. Vaughn, Voss said, is currently reviewing documents and is not available. I have a message from Damien Moretti. I'm sure you do. Voss stepped back from the door without quite opening it wider. You can leave the message with me. The message is for her, and she'll receive it when she's ready. Those are her instructions, not mine. I'm simply the person standing in the doorway. He said it without aggression, without any discernible pleasure, in the flat tone of a man stating operational facts. Is there anything else? Marco stood in the corridor of the Alderton for a moment with the specific discomfort of a person who has been trained to apply pressure and has just encountered a surface that doesn't respond to it. He pulled out his phone. He sent a message back to the estate. She's there, won't come out. Voss is the wall. Damien's response came back in under a minute. Stay there. Inside the suite, Isabella was at the writing desk near the window, not reviewing documents. She was sitting with a glass of water and her coat still on her shoulders, looking at the city outside the glass. The documents were on the desk in front of her, but she wasn't reading them. She knew what they said. She had written most of them. Voss came back from the door and sat in the chair across from her. He was 64, had managed private wealth for the kind of families whose names didn't appear in newspapers for precisely the reasons that made them interesting. And he had known Isabella for 6 years. He had spent most of those 6 years being impressed by her in the careful, understated way of a man who doesn't impress easily. The young man is staying in the corridor, he said. I know. What would you like to do about that? Nothing, for now. She turned from the window. Henrik, I need to be clear about something. Of course. When I say I'm not signing the restructuring tonight, I'm not negotiating. I'm not creating leverage. I'm not running a play. She looked at him steadily. I'm telling you that I made a decision this evening, and the decision is that I'm no longer willing to act as the invisible infrastructure of an organization that has spent 9 years pretending I don't exist. That's not a position. It's just a fact. Voss was quiet for a moment. The cross-default clause. I know about the cross-default clause. I wrote the clause. Then you understand that if the review triggers, 6 properties enter seizure proceedings. Yes. I also understand that the seizure process takes a minimum of 90 days, during which a number of conversations can happen and a number of decisions can be made. She picked up the water glass. I'm not blowing up the empire, Henrik. I'm not interested in destruction. I'm interested in a different kind of conversation than the one I've been having for 9 years. And the only way to have a different conversation is to change the conditions. Voss leaned back. And if Damien doesn't, then the conditions change without him. She set the glass down. I've been building contingency architecture for 18 months. The Vaughn advisory structure is ready. The client relationships are established. I can walk out of the Moretti financial portfolio with 90% of the value I've built and rebuild it under my own name within a year. A pause. That's not a threat. That's just the planning I did when I understood the marriage was ending. When did you understand that? She thought about it. 2 years ago, she said. Maybe 3. You understand these things gradually and then all at once. In the corridor, Marco Sette was sitting on a chair the concierge had brought him with the resigned patience of a man following instructions he found pointless. His phone buzzed. Not Damien this time. Verano. What's the layout? Suite 404. Voss is with her. Doors closed. She's not coming out. Anyone else in the suite? Unknown. Felt like more people inside, but I didn't get a look. A pause, then. Calderon people were spotted 2 blocks from the Alderton 40 minutes ago. Stay sharp. Marco read the message twice. He looked down the corridor in both directions. The hotel was quiet at this hour. The soft, expensive quiet of a place designed to make wealthy people feel insulated from the world. He felt, for the first time tonight, the specific unease of a man who is standing in the middle of something much larger than the instructions he was given, without any clarity about which direction the danger is actually coming from. He dialed Damien directly. Damien answered on the second ring. Talk, She's in the suite. Voss won't open the door. But sir, Verano just messaged. Calderone people near the hotel. A silence on the line that lasted long enough for Marco to count his own heartbeats. How close, Damien said. 2 blocks. 40 minutes ago, so possibly closer now. Another silence, then, get to the stairwell. Don't stand in the open corridor, and do not knock on that door again. What do I do if... You wait, and you watch the elevator. The line went dead. Marco moved to the stairwell door at the end of the corridor. He pushed it open and stood just inside, keeping the suite door in his sightline through the narrow vertical gap. His heart was doing something he didn't appreciate. The Calderone family had been circling the Moretti organization for 2 years, probing for weaknesses the way carrion birds circle something they aren't sure is dead yet. If they knew about Isabella's departure, and information moved fast in the world these men occupied, then they also knew what that departure meant for the Moretti financial structure. And men like the Calderones did not allow vulnerability to exist unaddressed. Back at the estate, Damien was in the study Isabella had used for years, he now realized, looking at the organized desk, the labeled file boxes, the framed financial certificates on the wall that he had walked past 100 times without reading. And he was on the phone with Castellano, who was in his car en route to a meeting with the family's federal liaison attorney. Tell me about the Calderones, Damien said. What specifically? How much do they know about our financial structure? A pause on the line that was its own answer. Castellano. There was a security audit last spring. You remember, Isabella ran it. She identified 3 points of potential information leakage in the accounting division. A careful pause. 2 of those points were addressed. The third? The third involved a mid-level accounts coordinator named Prentice, who Isabella flagged as a potential Calderone contact. She recommended immediate termination and brought it to you in April. Damien was very still. You told her to handle it, Castellano said. She followed up twice. You told her both times you'd deal with it when you had a chance. Another pause. Prentice is still employed. The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that happens when a person finally counts the full cost of a decision they dismissed at the time as minor. Damien set the phone down on the desk without ending the call. He stood in Isabella's study with the organized files and the framed certificates and the quiet evidence of years of invisible work. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not anger, not fear exactly. Something worse. The specific nauseating weight of understanding that the mistakes weren't just financial or operational. They were personal. Repeated. Accumulated across years of a man receiving warnings from a woman he'd trained himself to undervalue, dismissing each one and moving on. He picked the phone back up. Get Prentice out of the building tonight. Full lockdown on the accounting division. Change every access credential that touches the Voss portfolio accounts. If Prentice has already passed information, then we contain the damage. Do it. He ended the call. He sat in Isabella's chair. On the desk in front of him, left in the top right corner, was a single sheet of paper she hadn't taken with her. He almost didn't pick it up. When he did, he recognized the handwriting, the compressed, precise script she used when she was working quickly. It was a list, 12 items, dates, transaction amounts, counterparty names, brief outcome notes. The list was every crisis he didn't know he'd had. The shipping division's federal review in 2019 quietly resolved through a refinancing restructure she'd arranged in 6 weeks. The New Jersey construction contracts, which had been on the edge of a money laundering investigation until she'd restructured the payment flows through a compliant intermediary. The Voss relationship itself, built from a cold introduction she'd made at a conference he hadn't attended because he'd had a conflict he no longer remembered. 12 items. He'd been aware, in a vague way, that Isabella managed things. He'd allowed himself the comfortable imprecision of not knowing exactly what that meant, because knowing exactly what it meant would have required him to acknowledge something about the balance of the marriage that his particular kind of pride had never been willing to examine. 12 items. $4 billion. And a woman who had walked out of his dinner table carrying both. At the Alderton, at 12:31 in the morning, the elevator at the end of the corridor chimed. Marcoset pulled the stairwell door back slightly, enough to see. The doors opened. Two men stepped out, moving with the controlled, purposeful efficiency of people who knew exactly where they were going. Marco recognized one of them. Not personally, but by reputation, which in the world he occupied was the same thing. His phone was already in his hand. His thumb was already on Damien's number, because the man stepping out of the elevator was named Gio Calderone, and he was walking directly towards Suite 404, and the distance between him and Isabella Vaughn's door was approximately 30 feet and closing fast. Marco's thumb hit the call button the same second Gio Calderone's knuckles hit the door of Suite 404. The knock was not aggressive. That was the thing that made it worse. It was the calm, unhurried knock of a man who has already decided how the next 10 minutes are going to go and feels no particular urgency about it. Two knocks, a pause, then one more. Marco pressed himself flat against the stairwell door and watched through the gap. Calderone was mid-40s, compact, with the kind of face that had been handsome before years of specific stress had tightened it into something harder. The man beside him was larger, younger, standing a half step back and to the left in the practiced positioning of someone whose job was spatial. Damien picked up on the first ring. "Calderone is at the door," Marco whispered. The silence on the line lasted exactly 2 seconds. "How did he get past the lobby?" "I don't know. He just walked off the elevator." "Is she opening it?" Marco watched. The suite door remained closed. "Not yet." "Stay on the line. Don't move." Inside Suite 404, Isabella had heard the knock. She had been mid-sentence with Voss when the sound came through the door. 2 sharp impacts and then one. A rhythm that carried no anxiety in it, which was more alarming than urgency would have been. She and Voss exchanged a look. He was already reaching for his own phone. "Are you expecting anyone else?" she said. "No." She stood and moved to the door without hesitation. Not to open it, to listen. She put her palm flat against the wood and felt nothing through it, which meant whoever was on the other side was not pressing close to it, which meant they were comfortable waiting. She looked through the peephole. Gio Calderone looked back, not quite at the peephole, slightly to the left of it, in the way of a man who knew he was being observed and was making a deliberate choice to appear unconcerned. Isabella straightened. "Ms. Vaughn." His voice came through the door at a conversational volume, not raised. "I know you're there. I'm not here to cause a problem. I'm here because I have information you need tonight, and I think you're intelligent enough to know the difference between a threat and an offer." She said nothing. "The man in your stairwell works for your husband," Calderone said. "There are 2 of my people at the lobby entrance making sure Damien doesn't send reinforcement while we talk. This is a conversation, not a confrontation. I give you my word on that." Voss had crossed the room and was standing at her shoulder. He murmured, "We don't have to open it." "I know," she said. She thought for 3 seconds. Then she opened the door. Calderone came in alone. He left the larger man in the corridor, which was either a genuine gesture of good faith or a very well-constructed performance of one. He looked around the suite with the brief, cataloging glance of a man assessing rooms out of professional habit, then looked at Isabella with the specific attention of someone who has studied a subject at length and is now seeing it in person for the first time. "You're taller than I expected," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He didn't remove his coat. He placed his hands on his knees in a posture that was open, deliberate, engineered to communicate non-aggression to someone who was reading him carefully. He was good at this. She noted that. "How did you know I was here?" she said. "Prentice." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Isabella felt it in the back of her sternum. Not quite shock, because she had flagged Prentice 8 months ago, and the shock of that flag being ignored had already done its damage then. What she felt now was the specific cold of confirmation. "How long?" she said. 14 months, Calderone said. "We weren't after your financial structure. We were monitoring communication patterns to understand the Moretti decision-making chain." He paused. "What we found fairly quickly was that the decision-making chain was you, not Damien." Voss moved to the chair beside the window and sat without speaking. He was listening with the total stillness of a man who understood that the next several minutes were going to determine outcomes that his very careful planning had not accounted for. "What do you want?" Isabella said. "To show you something." Calderon reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He set it on the coffee table between them and did not push it toward her. He let it sit there. She leaned forward and unfolded it herself. It was a financial summary, 2 pages, dense with figures, account numbers, transaction dates. She read the first page in approximately 45 seconds, which was faster than most people could have parsed the column headers. Then she read it again. Her face did not change during either read, but her right hand, resting on her knee, closed slowly into a fist she did not release. "This is the Voss Group restructuring proposal," she said. "The original version," Calderon said, "filed internally 14 months ago." She looked up. "The version I have is dated 8 months ago." "I know." She looked at Voss. Henrik Voss was looking at the window, not at the city through it, at the glass itself. A man studying the surface of something rather than what lay beyond it, which was the behavior of a person buying time they had run out of. "Henrik," she said. He didn't answer immediately. The pause was 5 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than innocence would have required. "The original proposal," he said finally, still looking at the window, "had different terms. The temperature in the room did something that had nothing to do with the climate system." Isabella opened the second page of the document. She read. The fist on her knee tightened further. She could feel her pulse in her throat, steady and accelerating, the body doing what bodies do when the mind is absorbing something it is not ready to absorb. The original proposal, the one dated 14 months ago, the one Gio Calderone had just placed on a coffee table in a hotel suite at 12:30 in the morning, restructured the Moretti financial portfolio under a new holding structure. The new holding structure named a primary beneficiary for the consolidated assets. The name was not Isabella Vaughn. The name was Henrik Voss. "Explain this to me," she said. Her voice was completely flat. Not quiet with suppressed emotion. Flat in the way of a person who has moved past the emotion into something colder and more functional. "Explain this to me right now, Henrik, because what I'm reading is that the restructuring I've been building for 18 months, using my guarantees, my relationships, my name, was designed from the beginning to transfer consolidated control of $4 billion in assets to you." Voss turned from the window. He looked at her. He was 64 years old, and he had managed wealth for dangerous people for 4 decades. And the expression he wore was the specific expression of a man who has been caught not in a moment of weakness, but in a plan. Something constructed, deliberate, patient. "Isabella, don't." The word came out hard. "Don't use my name like that. Just answer the question." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The original structure was a commercial proposal, standard consolidation terms. My name isn't on the beneficiary line. The beneficiary structure was a preliminary. Stop." She stood. The document was still in her hands. She set it on the table with deliberate care, which took more control than throwing it would have, and that control was visible in the set of her shoulders and the way she breathed through it. "You came to me 6 years ago. You said the Voss Group wanted to build a long-term relationship with the Moretti financial portfolio. I brought you in. I structured every deal. I signed every guarantee." She stopped. "You were using my access, my credibility, my legal exposure, to build a consolidation structure that was going to transfer the assets to your holding entity when the restructuring finalized." Voss did not deny it. That was its own answer. Calderon was watching this exchange with the neutral attention of a man at a professional distance, not enjoying it, simply observing it with the focus of someone who needs to understand what the person across from him is going to do next. "How much does he know?" Isabella said to Calderon without looking away from Voss. "We identified the original proposal structure 8 months ago," Calderon said. "We've been watching to see if you knew. And you clearly didn't." A pause. "Which is why I'm here." She finally looked at him. "You're not doing this out of goodwill." "No," he said. "I'm doing this because the Calderon family has a specific interest in what happens to the Moretti financial portfolio, and that interest is better served by the portfolio remaining in human hands we can negotiate with than by it being absorbed into a private banking entity that answers to no one." He leaned forward slightly. Voss doesn't need to negotiate with anyone. If he controls the consolidated assets, he has no reason to talk to us, to you, or to Damien. He simply has the money. Isabella stood in the center of the suite with the document on the table in front of her and the two men on either side of the equation watching her, and she felt something she had not felt since the earliest years of her marriage, when she was still learning how to be the kind of person who survived in the world she had entered. She felt the specific vertigo of discovering that the ground she had been standing on had been engineered by someone else. She had built 18 months of contingency planning on the assumption that Henrik Voss was her instrument. The Vaughn advisory structure she had described to him an hour ago, the client relationships, the portfolio transfer, the clean exit from the Moretti organization, all of it had been built on the Voss infrastructure. All of it was compromised. She needed 30 seconds. She took them. Then she picked up her phone and walked to the far side of the room. She dialed a number from memory. It rang 4 times before a woman answered. "You know what time it is?" the woman said without hostility, in the voice of someone accustomed to calls at irregular hours. "Yes," Isabella said. "I need you to run a corporate structure search on the Voss private group, parent entities, subsidiary holdings, beneficiary designations on any consolidation instruments filed in the last 24 months. Everything. Tonight. In the next 2 hours." A pause. "That's going to cost." "I know what it's going to cost. Do it." She ended the call. She turned back to the room. Voss had not moved. Calderon was watching her with the close attention he'd brought into the suite. "You said you had information I needed," she said to Calderon. "You've given me one piece of it. What's the rest?" He reached into his coat again. This time he produced a small drive. Black, unmarked, the size of a thumb. He placed it on the table beside the document. 14 months of communication logs from the Prentice Intercept, he said. Includes Voss's internal correspondence about the consolidation timeline. The target date for restructuring completion. He paused. And a set of communications that are not from Voss. She looked at the drive. "Who else?" "Your husband's attorney," Calderon said. "Castellano." The room rearranged itself around that name. Isabella's expression did not change. This was a discipline she had developed across years of sitting in rooms where showing reaction was a liability. But the particular quality of her stillness shifted in a way that Calderon, who was good at reading people, registered and filed. "Castellano has been in contact with Voss since last March," Calderon said. "The communication pattern suggests he was aware of the original consolidation structure. We haven't been able to confirm whether Damien knew." "Damien didn't know," she said. "You sound certain." "I am certain." She said it without hesitation. "Damien is many things. He is not capable of executing a financial conspiracy that requires patience and precision. That is not his nature." A pause. Castellano, on the other hand, she picked up the drive. She turned it in her fingers once, looked at it, and set it back down. "Why are you giving me this?" she said. "You could use this yourself." "Against who?" Calderon said. "Damien? We've never been at war with the Moretti organization. We've been adjacent to it. We have no interest in destroying it." He looked at her directly. "We have an interest in it being run by someone competent. The last 9 years, that person has been you. We'd like that to continue." "I don't work for the Calderon family." "I'm not asking you to." He stood, which signaled the end of what he'd come to say. "I'm telling you that the Calderon family will not interfere with whatever you decide to do next. And if you need a particular door opened in the next 72 hours, you can reach me through the channel you already know about." She looked at him. "I don't know what channel you mean." "The Lanzetti account manager," he said. "She's been a mutual contact for 3 years. You've used her for currency exchange on the shipping division settlements." He almost smiled. "We've known about you for a long time, Ms. Vaughn. We've just been waiting for the right moment to introduce ourselves." He buttoned his coat. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "Voss is going to try to accelerate the restructuring timeline now that this conversation has happened," he said. "He'll know by morning that we were here. He'll move fast." He looked at her. "Faster than you expect." He left. The door closed. Isabella and Henrik Voss were alone in the suite. She stood across the room from him. He was still in the chair. He had the posture of a man who had been cornered and was deciding whether to negotiate or simply wait, and the calculation behind his eyes was still running, which told her more than his silence did. "How long?" she said. He looked at her. "How long were you planning to let this run before you triggered the consolidation?" "Isabella, the structure was—" "How long?" He exhaled. It was the exhale of a man releasing the weight of maintaining a position. "The restructuring was set to complete in 90 days, he said, "from your signature. Once you signed, the consolidation triggers automatically under the subsidiary holding agreement, which I haven't read, which is 60 pages of standard consolidation language with one non-standard clause on page 44. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, not from despair, from the specific discipline of a person cataloging what they know and what they need to know, running the sequence. Page 44. A clause. Buried in 60 pages that she had trusted because she had trusted the man who handed them to her, which was the oldest and most expensive mistake in the history of financial arrangements between human beings. "Get out," she said. "Isabella, get out of this suite, Henrik, right now." He stood. He picked up his coat from the arm of the chair with the careful movements of a man who knows that any sudden action in this moment carries risk. He walked to the door. He paused. "The drive Calderon left," he said. "It won't be enough. You need the original filing documents from the subsidiary structure to prove the consolidation was fraudulent. Those are held by a law firm in Luxembourg." She said nothing. "I'm telling you because," he started, and then stopped, and she understood that he had no ending for that sentence that would survive contact with her. He left. She stood alone in the suite. She walked to the desk and sat. She put both hands flat on the surface the way she had done in the study at the estate 2 hours ago, but the feeling underneath it was entirely different. At the estate, she had felt clarity. Here she felt the particular sensation of a person who has just discovered that the map they have been navigating by was drawn by someone who wanted them to get lost. Her phone buzzed. Marco Set, from the corridor. She'd been sent his number by Damien's office months ago as a security contact, and he had apparently decided this was the moment to use that connection. "Are you all right?" She stared at the message. Then she called Damien. He answered before the first ring completed, which told her he'd been sitting with the phone in his hand. "Isabella, I need to come back to the estate," she said. "Tonight. Not because of you. Because we have a problem that is larger than either of us, and the only way through it requires both of us in the same room." Silence on the line. She could hear him breathing. "Castellano," she said. "Tell me where he is right now." The silence changed quality. "Damien!" Her voice was sharp. "Where is Castellano?" "He was driving to meet the federal liaison attorney," Damien said slowly. "I sent him an hour ago." "Call him, right now. Tell him to turn around." She paused. "And when he doesn't answer, which he won't, I need you to understand that the man you sent to manage tonight's crisis is the same man who has been feeding your financial architecture to a private banking entity that was planning to absorb everything you own the moment I signed a document I had not yet read carefully enough." The silence on the line was the longest one of the night. "Come back," Damien said. His voice had lost every register of the man who had stood at the head of the dinner table 3 hours ago and introduced the woman beside him as the one who truly belonged there. What was left sounded like someone standing in a room that had just lost all its walls. "I'll be there in 40 minutes, she said. She picked up the drive Calderon had left on the table. She put it in her coat pocket. She picked up the original consolidation document and folded it along its creases. She put that in her other pocket. She looked at the suite around her, the careful, expensive neutrality of it, the room that had been the location of her exit and had just become the location of something else entirely. She walked to the door. In the corridor, Marco Sette was on his feet. He looked at her with the uncertain expression of a young man who had spent the last hour watching things move well outside the boundaries of his instructions. "Take me back to the estate," she said. He nodded and moved toward the elevator without a word. As the elevator doors closed, Isabella felt the drive in her pocket. Small, unmarked, 14 months of someone else's careful planning sitting against her ribs, and understood, with the full weight of a person who has just had the ground rebuilt under their feet by an enemy rather than an ally, that the exit she had planned was gone, and what stood in its place was something she had not prepared for and could not avoid, and that the next move she made was going to have to be the most precise thing she had ever done in her life. The car moved through the city with the particular urgency of a vehicle driven by someone who has been told to hurry without being told why, and Isabella sat in the back seat with the drive in her coat pocket and the folded document against her ribs, and her hands open on her knees, not fisted, because fists meant tension she couldn't afford right now, and what she needed in the next 40 minutes was to think with the kind of cold precision that the last 3 hours had been systematically trying to destroy. She started from the beginning. Voss had come to her 6 years ago. She had verified his credentials, his institutional history, his client roster, all of which had been real, because the best long-term deceptions are built on real foundations. She had built the relationship carefully, introduced him to the Moretti financial infrastructure gradually, let the trust accumulate through a sequence of successful transactions. He had been patient. 14 months ago, he had filed the original consolidation proposal, before she had any reason to suspect, before Prentice had been flagged, before any of the conditions that might have made her look more carefully at the documents were in place. He had waited for the moment when she would be distracted enough by the deterioration of her marriage to not read page 44 of a 60-page subsidiary agreement. He had been waiting for Damien to give him that moment. She thought about that. She turned it in her mind the way she turned financial instruments, looking for the load-bearing element, the thing the entire structure depended on. Voss had needed her distracted. He had needed her motivated to exit quickly. He had needed her to trust the restructuring documents without the scrutiny she would normally have applied. Damien's behavior tonight had been the trigger. She did not know if Castellano had engineered that. She did not know, yet, how deep the coordination went. But Castellano had been in contact with Voss since March, which meant there were 3 possibilities. Castellano had been recruited by Voss independently, Castellano had approached Voss with the scheme, or there was a third party she hadn't identified yet who had arranged both. The drive would tell her which. The Luxembourg documents would confirm it legally. She needed both before she walked into the estate council chamber, because walking in with incomplete information was the only version of this that she could not survive. She picked up her phone. The woman she'd called earlier, the one she'd asked for the corporate structure search, answered on the second ring. "I've got partial results," she said without preamble. "Talk." The Voss private group has 3 parent entities, all registered in jurisdictions with minimal disclosure requirements. The top-level holding structure is a Liechtenstein foundation. The foundation's named protector is an individual listed only by a legal reference number under the jurisdiction's privacy laws. A pause. But the law firm administering the foundation is a Luxembourg practice called Dreher und Stein. Isabella was already writing on the back of the folded document with a pen she'd taken from the car's console. Dreher und Stein. I need their primary contact for the Voss account. That I can't get tonight. Can you get me an address for their office? That's public, Rue de la Loye, number 47. But Isabella, I know. She ended the call. She looked at the address she'd written. Luxembourg was 6 hours ahead. Their offices would open in 5.5 hours. She needed someone in-country who could be at that door when it opened. She scrolled her contacts. She found a name, a man named Brouwer, a former regulatory attorney who now operated as a private document retrieval specialist in the European financial sector. She had used him twice. Both times he had been expensive and exact. She dialed him. He answered in German, then switched when she identified herself. "What do you need?" "Dreher and Stein in Luxembourg. Morning opening. I need you at the door with a formal document request for the beneficiary structure of any consolidation instruments held under the Voss private group account. I'll send you the authorization language in the next 20 minutes. That's a same-day fee. I know the fee. Do it." She ended the call. She looked out the window. The city moved past in the way cities move at 1 in the morning, half lit, half populated, the particular combination of late-night energy and emptiness that makes the middle of a crisis feel simultaneously urgent and surreal. The estate gates appeared through the windshield. The security detail at the entrance waved the car through without stopping it, which told her Damien had communicated her return. Marco pulled the car around to the main entrance. Isabella was out before he'd fully stopped. Ricci was at the door. He looked like a man who had aged 3 years in 3 hours. "Where?" she said. "The council chamber, ma'am. Mr. Moretti and Mr. Ferrano. The attorneys are—" "Which attorneys?" "The civil litigation team, not Castellano." "Good." She moved past him. The council chamber was on the estate's second floor, a room she had sat in dozens of times over 9 years, but had never occupied in the way she was about to occupy it. She pushed the door open. Damien was at the head of the table. Ferrano was to his left. 2 attorneys she recognized from the civil litigation firm were at the far end with laptops open. The room smelled of coffee and tension, that specific combination of stimulant and stress that had a physical quality to it, something that sat in the back of the throat. Damien looked at her when she entered. He looked at her the way he hadn't looked at her in years, with full attention, without the layer of comfortable inattention she had become accustomed to. It did not make her feel warm. It made her feel the way you feel when something that has been misaligned for a long time is suddenly forced back into position, a recognition without comfort in it. She sat down at the table, not at the far end, at the center, across from Ferrano. She put the drive on the table. She put the original Voss document beside it. "Here's where we are," she said. She talked for 11 minutes without interruption. She laid out the Voss consolidation structure, the Castellano communication pattern, the Calderone meeting, the Luxembourg filing, the 90-day trigger clause on page 44. She did it the way she did everything, sequentially, without emotional editorializing, with the specific precision that comes from having spent 6 years building the thing she was now dismantling. When she finished, the room was quiet. Ferrano looked at the drive. "Calderone just handed you this." "Yes." "Why?" "Because the Calderone family's interests are better served by a negotiable Moretti organization than by a Voss-controlled consolidated holding entity." She looked at him. "They're not doing us a favor. They're protecting their own position." "But the information is real." "The information is real." Ferrano sat back. He was working through it the way he worked through everything, with the systematic patience of a man who has survived by never moving faster than his understanding. "Castellano," he said. "Yes." "He's been with this family for 22 years. "I know." "How does a man do 22 years and then—" "Money," she said flatly, "and probably a gradual accumulation of resentment toward an organization that he felt had stopped valuing him appropriately. Those are the 2 factors that turn long-term loyalty into betrayal almost every time." She paused. "I'm not interested in understanding Castellano's psychology tonight. I'm interested in what he knows, who he's talked to in the last 3 hours, and whether he's already made contact with Voss to report on what happened at the Alderton." One of the civil litigation attorneys looked up from his laptop. "We've been trying to reach him since Mr. Moretti's instruction. His phone is going to voicemail." "He's running," Ferrano said. "Or he's been told to go dark by Voss," Isabella said, "which is worse because it means Voss already knows the consolidation timeline is compromised and he's moving to protect the documents." "How long does he have to protect them?" She looked at the table. "If Brouwer gets into the Dreyer and Stein offices at opening and the document request goes through without legal challenge, I have the originals in my hands electronically by noon Luxembourg time, which is 6 in the morning here." She paused. "If Voss contacts the law firm tonight and instructs them to stall, then we need Castellano," Damien said. It was the first time he'd spoken since she'd begun. His voice was different than it had been at the dinner table, stripped of the performance he usually carried in group settings. He sounded like a man who had been down to the foundation of something and found it less solid than he'd believed. "We need Castellano's communications with Voss," she said. "His phone, his email, whatever channel he was using. If we have those, we don't need the Luxembourg documents to establish the fraud. We can establish it through the communication record." Ferrano looked at Damien. Damien looked at Ferrano. Something passed between them that was not a question because both men already knew the answer. "Sal," Damien said. Ferrano was already on his phone. The next 2 hours had a different quality than the hours before them. Not slower, but more contained, the urgency channeled into specific actions rather than expanding outward into chaos. Isabella worked at the council table with one of the litigation attorneys, drafting the document request language for Brouwer in Luxembourg. Damien made calls she didn't listen to from the far side of the room, his voice low and constant. Ferrano left and returned twice without explanation, which was its own kind of explanation. At 3:14 in the morning, Ferrano set a phone on the table in front of Isabella. It was not his phone. Castellano's second phone, he said. The one we didn't know about. She picked it up. It was unlocked. Ferrano's people had methods she did not ask about. She went directly to the message application. She found the thread she was looking for in under 20 seconds because Henrik Voss was organized and had apparently not considered the possibility that this phone would ever be in anyone else's hands. She read. The thread went back 11 months. The first messages were careful, indirect, the kind of language people use when they are testing how explicitly they can speak. By month 3, the language had become direct. By month 6, there were specific figures. By month 9, there were timelines. The most recent message in the thread was from 2 hours ago, 40 minutes after she'd left the estate, and it was from Castellano to Voss. She left. Didn't sign. Damien is contained. Proceeding? Voss's response. Accelerate. Get her signature or get her out of the equation. We close in 60 days, not 90. She set the phone down. She looked at the table surface for a moment, at the grain of the wood, at the specific texture of something solid and real. Then she looked up. 60 days, she said. He's accelerating the timeline. She looked at Damien. He's going to come at us legally. He'll file for emergency enforcement of the existing guarantee instruments on the basis that my departure constitutes a material default. He'll trigger the cross-default clause himself rather than wait for it to happen organically. Damien's jaw was tight. Can he do that? With the right legal argument, yes. The guarantee documents I signed have a clause allowing the guarantor institution to initiate review under certain conditions. He'll argue that my departure from the Moretti organization constitutes a change in the underlying conditions of the guarantee. She paused. It's a weak argument legally, but weak arguments filed at 5 in the morning with an emergency injunction application don't need to win. They just need to create enough procedural chaos to delay me from accessing the Luxembourg documents until he can move them. So we have hours, she said, if that. The room gathered itself around that word. She pulled the laptop toward her and opened the draft document request for Brouwer. She read it. She made 3 changes, each one tightening the legal specificity of the request in a way that reduced the surface area for a stalling objection from the law firm. She sent it to Brouwer with a message. Filing language attached. Do not wait for office opening. Contact the managing partner's emergency line. This is a fraud preservation request. Use those exact words. Brouwer responded in 4 minutes. Understood. I'll need a wire confirmation of the retainer by 4 a.m. my time. She looked at Damien. I need a wire transfer authorized. 200,000 euros to a Luxembourg account in the next 30 minutes. He didn't hesitate. Tell Ricci the account number. She sent Brouwer the instruction and turned back to the table. We also need to file a preemptive motion in the Federal District Court here, something that establishes the fraudulent nature of the guarantee structure before Voss can file his enforcement action. That motion needs to be ready to go the moment the Luxembourg documents are in hand. One of the litigation attorneys had already started typing. What's the theory? Fraudulent inducement, she said. I signed the guarantee instruments under a material misrepresentation about the nature of the consolidation structure. The instruments are void if we can establish that Voss concealed the true beneficiary arrangement at the time of execution. She looked at him. That's why the Luxembourg filing is essential. We need the original consolidation document with the filing date, 14 months ago, to prove the concealment was intentional and predated every guarantee I signed. The attorney nodded, already building the motion framework on his screen. Ferrano had been quiet for several minutes. What about Castellano? Isabella looked at him. He's a witness. Whatever he knows about the Voss communication history goes into the fraud narrative. If he's found and he cooperates, he reduces his exposure. If he runs, we proceed without him, and his absence becomes part of the evidentiary record. He won't run far, Ferrano said, in a tone that implied he had already taken steps to limit the available distance. She didn't ask for details. At 4:47 in the morning, her phone rang. Brower. She answered immediately. I reached the managing partner, he said. She was unhappy about the hour. She was more unhappy when I read her the specific clause numbers from the Voss account documentation that I needed access to. A pause. She said she would need to consult with the account holder before releasing anything. That's a stall. Yes. But she said something else. She said, and I wrote this down exactly, the documents you're describing were updated 3 hours ago. Isabella went very still. 3 hours ago, she said. Someone modified the filing. She wouldn't tell me what was changed. But the modification timestamp is 3 hours ago, which is 40 minutes after I left this estate, she said. Voss moved faster than 60 days. He moved tonight. Isabella, if the underlying documents have been modified, get me the pre-modification version, she said. Every major law firm in Luxembourg maintains document versioning on their secure filing system. The original is still in there. I need it before their business day starts, and they can lock me out with a formal legal hold. That requires direct system access. I know what it requires. She thought for 3 seconds. There's a digital forensic firm in Amsterdam called Kesteren. Use my name. Tell them it's preservation of evidence in an active fraud proceeding. They've done this before. She ended the call and looked at the room. It was almost 5 in the morning. Every person at that table had the specific appearance of people who have been awake too long under conditions of sustained high-stakes pressure. Eyes that had lost their social surfaces, movements that had stripped down to the functional, the particular honesty of exhaustion. Damien was looking at her. He'd been looking at her for the last hour with the expression of a man trying to reconcile 2 different pictures of the same person, the picture he'd carried for 9 years and the one that was assembling itself in front of him in real time. She didn't have space for that right now. I need Voss's physical location, she said. Not the hotel, where he actually stays in this city. Ferrano looked at one of his people near the door. The man left immediately. At 5:21, Isabella's phone received a message from the Kesteren firm's emergency line, pre-modification version located in versioning archive. Extracting now. Delivery in 15 minutes to your secure email. She stood up from the table. Her back hurt. She had been sitting with a compression in her shoulders for 4 hours that was now a sustained ache she couldn't fully straighten out. She walked to the window of the council chamber and looked at the estate grounds in the pre-dawn dark. The geometry of the hedges, the gravel of the paths, the outline of things she had managed and organized and protected for 9 years without ever having her name on any of it. Her phone buzzed. The secure email. She opened it. The pre-modification version of the Voss consolidation filing was 47 pages. She went directly to the beneficiary clause. It was there, her exclusion, Voss's designation, the specific legal language that had been designed to look like standard boilerplate on a cursory read. She forwarded it to the litigation attorney with 3 words. Build the motion. She turned back to the room. We have the document, she said. The attorney was already incorporating it. His co-counsel was on the phone with the district court clerk's emergency filing line. Ferrano was speaking quietly to Damien at the far end of the room, their voices too low to hear, the posture of 2 men making a decision that was not going to be discussed at the table. At 5:58 in the morning, the Federal District Court emergency filing received the Moretti-Vaughan fraud preservation motion. At 6:03, the court's duty clerk confirmed receipt and assigned an emergency docket number. At 6:11, a copy of the filing was formally served on the Voss Private Group's registered legal address by digital process, the modern equivalent of nailing something to a door, but faster and considerably harder to ignore. Isabella sat back in her chair and felt the specific quality of a thing that has been set in motion that cannot be stopped. Not relief, not victory, something more mechanical than either. She had built the legal wall. The next 12 hours would determine if it held. Her phone rang. An unknown number. She looked at it for 1 second, then answered. Ms. Vaughan. Henrik Voss's voice, steady, still, carrying the same quality it had carried in the hotel suite, except that the quality now had a different foundation. I assume you filed? Yes. I'm looking at the docket number now. A pause. You moved quickly. I had good information. Calderon, he said, not a question. among others. A silence on the line that lasted long enough to be a full recalibration. This doesn't have to become a legal proceeding, he said. There is a settlement structure that… Henrik. She said his name the way he'd tried to say hers in the hotel suite, as a boundary. You built a 6-year fraud on my credibility, my legal exposure, and my access. You used the worst night of my personal life as the trigger point for a consolidation that was going to transfer $4 billion in assets to your holding entity without my knowledge or consent. She paused. There is no settlement structure. Silence. When the Luxembourg documents are formally entered into the federal record, she said, every guarantee instrument I signed under the Voss private group relationship will be legally voided on the basis of fraudulent inducement. The Moretti financial portfolio will revert to its pre-Voss structure, and the civil fraud complaint we file in the next 48 hours will name you, your Luxembourg counsel, and every entity in the Liechtenstein Foundation chain. She stopped. That is where we are, Henrik. His breath on the line was the only sound. Castellano, he said finally. He'll testify that you were aware of the… Castellano's phone is in my possession, she said. 11 months of messages between you and him are currently being reviewed by 2 federal litigation attorneys in this room. She let that sit. Try a different argument. The line went dead. She set the phone on the table. The council chamber had that particular stillness again. The stillness of people who have just witnessed something and are processing its full dimensions. Ferrano had a small, controlled expression that on any other man's face would have been a smile. The litigation attorney had stopped typing and was looking at her. Damien was at the end of the table with his hands flat on the surface and an expression she could not fully read. Not the stunned blankness of earlier, something harder and more complicated than that. She looked at him. He said, Isabella? Her phone buzzed. Brouwer in Luxembourg. She held up one finger and answered. Dreyer and Stein just received a formal legal hold notice from the Voss Group's Luxembourg Council, Brouwer said. They're locking the files, but Isabella, the managing partner called me back. Off the record. She said there's a secondary set of documents in the Foundation archive that the Voss Council specifically did not name in the hold notice. She said she thinks the omission was deliberate, that whoever filed the hold notice didn't know those documents existed. Isabella straightened. What documents? She wouldn't say over the phone. She wants a meeting, in person. A pause. Luxembourg, today. The council chamber was waiting. She stood and looked at Damien across the table, at the man she had spent 9 years protecting, at the empire she had spent 9 years holding together from a position of deliberate invisibility at the singular morning that had arrived on the other side of the worst night. And she said, Book me on the first flight to Luxembourg. The flight to Luxembourg departed at 7:40 in the morning, and Isabella sat in the forward cabin with her coat folded across her lap and the Castellano phone in a sealed evidence bag in her carry-on, and 4 hours of broken sleep behind her eyes that felt like something considerably less than rest. The cabin was quiet at that hour. Business travelers with laptops and the particular contained energy of people moving between obligations. She did not open a laptop. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the clouds through the oval window and let herself, for the first time in 36 hours, simply be still. She thought about what stillness had cost her over 9 years. Not the productive stillness she'd used as a professional instrument. The careful quiet of a woman who understood that in rooms full of loud men, silence was its own form of power. She meant the other kind. The kind that had accumulated in the margins of her marriage like sediment, layer by layer, each small silencing depositing something she hadn't named at the time, because naming it would have required a confrontation she'd consistently judged as less important than the work. The work had always been more urgent. The work had always needed her more visibly than her own interior accounting did. She understood now, at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic, that this was how a person disappears without moving, not through drama or sudden rupture, but through 1,000 consecutive choices to defer the self in favor of the function. She had been very good at the function. She looked at her hands. The platinum bracelet was still on her wrist, the one she'd bought herself, the one Damien had never asked about. She turned it once. Then she looked back at the clouds and slept for 2 hours without dreaming. Brouwer met her at the Luxembourg airport in a dark sedan. He was 50-ish, economical in his movements, with the neutral affect of a man who had spent his career in proximity to other people's crises, and had learned not to absorb them. He had a coffee in the cup holder on her side of the car without being asked. She took it. "The managing partner's name is Elise Fontaine," he said, navigating toward the city. "She's been with Dreyer and Stein for 19 years. She did not participate in the original Voss account setup that was handled by a partner who retired 8 months ago." A pause. "She found out what the account contained approximately 4 months ago when she performed a routine internal audit." "She's known for 4 months." "Yes." "And she didn't report it." "She's a lawyer in a jurisdiction with strict client confidentiality laws," Brower said. "Her options were limited, but she's been watching. And when I called last night with the fraud preservation language, she made a decision." "What's in the secondary documents?" "She wouldn't tell me. She said she wants to give them to you directly." He glanced at her in the rear view. "She said, and I'm quoting, 'The woman should be the one to hold these, not a man representing her.'" A pause. "I thought you'd want to know she said that." Isabella drank the coffee. "Where are we meeting?" "Her private office, not the firm's main location." They drove in silence for several minutes through the ordered, prosperous streets of Luxembourg City, a place built on the premise that money handled discreetly and competently was its own form of civic virtue, which gave it a particular quality of quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. Elise Fontaine's private office was above a patisserie on a side street 2 blocks from the European Court of Justice. She was 60, with short silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead in the manner of someone who had put them there 2 hours ago and forgotten about them. She shook Isabella's hand with the grip of a woman who had been underestimated in professional settings for 4 decades and had made a discipline of the handshake as a first statement. "Sit," she said, in English, which she spoke without accent. "I'll tell you what I have, and then I'll tell you what I think you should do with it, and then you will make your own decision, because that is how this should work." Isabella sat. Fontaine opened a folder on her desk. Inside were documents printed on heavy paper, the kind of weight that legal archives use for permanence. She did not hand them across immediately. "When my former partner set up the Voss account 14 months ago," she said, "he filed the consolidation structure I believe you're already aware of, the fraudulent beneficiary designation, the hidden clause." She paused. "What he did not file with the main account, and what I found in a secondary archive folder that was mislabeled as administrative correspondence, was this." She slid the folder across the desk. Isabella opened it. The first page was a personal declaration, signed by Henrik Voss, dated 11 months ago, 3 months after the original consolidation filing, 2 months before Castellano had made first contact. She read, "It was not a legal instrument. It was something considerably more dangerous than a legal instrument. It was a narrative document, 6 pages in Voss's own hand, signed and notarized, in which he described, with the comprehensive specificity of a man creating a record for his own protection, the full architecture of the consolidation scheme. The recruitment of Castellano. The identification of Isabella as the access point. The strategy of waiting for a moment of personal crisis in the Moretti marriage to trigger the exit. The names of 3 other individuals, 2 in the financial sector, one described only as a government contact, who had been aware of the scheme and had provided assistance in exchange for a percentage of the consolidated assets. She read it twice. Then she turned to the last page, where the notary seal sat beside Voss's signature, and she looked at the date again, and she understood what she was holding. "He wrote this as insurance," she said. "Yes," Fontaine said, "in case any of his co-conspirators decided to expose him. A man who documents his own crime in that much detail is a man who needed everyone else to know the documentation existed." She paused. "He apparently forgot to tell my former partner exactly where he'd stored it. Or my former partner forgot to tell him that the firm's archiving system had a secondary folder structure that a retiring partner of 19 years would not necessarily communicate fully to his managing partner during a 3-week handover period." Fontaine looked at her steadily. "Yes." Isabella closed the folder. She sat for a moment with her hands on the cover of it, feeling the weight of the paper inside, the particular physical weight of something that changes the shape of what is possible. "The 3 other individuals he names," she said. "Do you know who they are?" I have suspicions about one of them based on the description," Fontaine said carefully. "I won't share those suspicions because they are not documented, and I am a lawyer who respects the difference." She paused. But I will tell you that the government contact he describes appears to have been positioned to delay any federal financial investigation of the consolidation for a period of approximately 6 months after it completed, which would have given Voss time to fully transfer and protect the assets before any regulatory response could reach them. The room had gone very quiet around that implication. 6 months of federal delay. That wasn't a bribe. That was a relationship. Something sustained, cultivated, valuable enough that it had been built and maintained for an eventuality that had never arrived. She filed that. She would give the document to the federal litigation team and let them run the name analysis. That was not her job. Her job, right now, was the thing immediately in front of her. She stood. "I need to make a call." Fontaine gestured toward the window. "Take the time you need." She walked to the window and looked down at the street below. The patisserie, a woman with a stroller, a delivery van making a turn with the particular unhurried competence of a driver who knows every centimeter of the available space. She dialed the lead federal litigation attorney back in New York. He answered immediately. "We've been watching the docket. The Voss emergency enforcement filing came in at 6 a.m. Judge Hartley has it." "Listen to me carefully," she said. She described the Fontaine documents in precise terms: the declaration, the notarization date, the co-conspirators, the government contact. She could hear the attorney typing before she was halfway through. When she finished, there was a silence on the line that had a different quality than the silences of the previous 12 hours. This one had the quality of a man recalibrating the size of what he was working with. "If that declaration is authenticated," he said slowly, "it's not just the civil fraud. This is conspiracy, wire fraud, potentially RICO implications depending on what the government contact's role was." "I know what it is. Isabella, this is federal criminal territory. This goes beyond the Moretti financial case." "I know what it is," she said again. "File the supplement to the preservation motion today. Include the declaration in the evidentiary record, and get me a meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office this week." She ended the call. She turned back to the room. Fontaine was watching her with the steady attention of a woman who has spent a career in the company of documents that change people's lives and has learned to observe the moment of change with the respect it deserves. "What do you need from me?" Fontaine said. "A certified copy of everything in that folder," Isabella said, "and a sworn statement from you regarding the circumstances of discovery, the archive mislabeling, the handover period, the date you found it." She paused. "Your testimony protects the chain of custody. Without it, Voss's lawyers argue the documents were tampered with." "I know," Fontaine said. "I've already prepared the statement." She opened her desk drawer and produced a second folder. "I prepared it last night after Mr. Brower called." Isabella looked at her. "I've been waiting 4 months for someone to ask the right question," Fontaine said simply. "Last night someone finally did." The return flight departed Luxembourg at 3 in the afternoon. Isabella sat in the same forward cabin seat with 2 certified document folders in her carry-on and the particular sensation of a person who has been in motion for 36 hours and is approaching the moment when motion becomes decision. She had accomplished what she came to do. The legal architecture was built. The evidentiary record was sealed. The federal process was in motion. What remained was the human portion of the accounting. She landed in New York at 6 in the evening, Eastern Time. Brower had arranged a car. She did not go to the estate. She went to her attorney's office in Midtown. A woman named Clara Rice, who had been her personal counsel for 11 years and whose relationship with Isabella existed entirely outside of the Moretti organizational structure, which was a decision Isabella had made in year 2 of the marriage, with the quiet foresight of a woman who understood that having one thing entirely her own was not a luxury, but a necessity. Clara was waiting. She had the kind of face that had processed a significant volume of other people's extremity without losing its essential quality of steady, humane attention. She looked at Isabella when she walked in, at the coat she'd been wearing for 2 days, at the controlled precision of her movements that was the visible form of exhaustion managed through will, and she said nothing immediately, which was one of the things Isabella had always appreciated about her. "Here," Clara said, and handed her a glass of water. Isabella drank it standing up. Then she sat. She gave Clara the full account in 40 minutes. Clara listened without interrupting except once, when Isabella described the page 44 clause, and Clara's expression did something brief and specific that was the attorney equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. When Isabella finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. "The divorce filing," Clara said. "Do you want to proceed simultaneously with the federal complaint or separately?" "Simultaneously," Isabella said. "I want it filed tomorrow morning." "The grounds?" "Irretrievable breakdown. I'm not using the fraud as grounds for the divorce. I don't want the divorce proceeding contaminated by the criminal case, and I don't want it to look like retaliation." She paused. "It's not retaliation. The marriage ended before any of this happened. The fraud is a separate matter." Clara nodded. Damien's response? "He won't contest it." She said it without satisfaction, without any particular emotional register. It was a statement of what she knew to be true based on 9 years of understanding a man's fundamental nature. Damien Moretti, faced with the full weight of the last 48 hours, was not going to compound his position by fighting a divorce that the entire world was now going to understand was deserved. He was many things. He was not stupid. "There's the matter of assets," Clara said. "I don't want the Moretti assets." She looked at Clara directly. "I want what is legally mine from the guarantee instruments, the fees and compensation that were never paid because I was operating as a family member rather than a contracted professional. I want that calculated and documented and settled. Beyond that—" She stopped. "Beyond that, I don't want anything that has the Moretti name on it." Clara made notes. "The calculation is going to be substantial." "I know. 8 to 9 figures, conservatively." "I know, Clara." Clara looked up. "And the Vaughn advisory structure." "Proceed with the incorporation. The client relationships are established. The operating framework is ready." Isabella paused. "The name changes, though." "What do you want?" "Vaughn Global Advisory Group." She said it once, simply, the way you say something you've been holding in your mouth for a while and are finally ready to release. "That's the name." Clara wrote it down. 3 days later, in the early evening, Isabella sat across from Damien Moretti in the library of the estate, a room lined with books that had been selected by a decorator and rarely read, which had always seemed to her a precise metaphor for something she'd never said out loud. They were alone. She had asked for that, and he had agreed to it without conditions, which was its own kind of statement about where they had arrived. He looked older than he had 4 days ago. Not physically. 3 days doesn't age a man's face, but in the way of a person who has had a significant portion of the story he told himself about himself revised in a short period of time, and whose body is carrying the weight of that revision. He had 2 glasses of water on the table between them. He'd remembered she preferred water. She noticed that he'd remembered. "The federal filing," he said. "Yes." "Castellano was picked up this morning." He said it without apparent satisfaction. I want you to know I didn't know. About him and Voss. I'm not asking you to believe that, I'm just telling you because it's true." "I know you didn't know," she said. "I told you that at the estate." "You were certain?" "Yes." He looked at the water glass. "What does that tell you about me?" "That my own attorney ran a fraud through my organization, and I had no idea." "It tells me you trusted someone who was positioned to receive trust," she said. "And it tells me you stopped asking hard questions about the infrastructure of your own business a long time ago, because asking hard questions was uncomfortable, and there was always someone handling it." She paused. "There was always me." He absorbed that. "Yes." "That's not entirely your failure," she said. "I made it easy to not ask, because I liked the work, because I was good at it, because somewhere in the early years I made a decision that competence was going to be my form of love, and I was going to demonstrate it by being indispensable." She stopped. "That's not a healthy way to love someone. It's a way of controlling the terms of a relationship so that you can never be truly rejected because you've made yourself too necessary to lose." She looked at him directly. "And you still found a way to reject me anyway. So that strategy had limits." The room was very quiet. Damien's jaw worked for a moment. He was not a man who had practice with this kind of conversation, with the specific exposure of being seen accurately by someone who had sufficient information and sufficient pain to use it destructively, and who was choosing not to. He didn't know what to do with that choice. She could see him not knowing. "I'm sorry," he said. "I've said it before and you haven't responded to it. I know. I want to understand if there's a version where Tsuru's—" "There isn't," she said. It was not harsh. It was the tone of a person stating a physical fact about the load-bearing capacity of something. Not because of Bianca. That was a symptom, not the cause. The cause is 9 years of a marriage where I was the foundation and you were the building. And buildings don't usually understand what holds them up until the foundation decides to be something else. She paused. "I'm going to be something else now." He looked at his hands on the table, large hands, the hands of the man she had married 23 years ago who had been different then. Not better exactly, but less calcified, less sealed inside the identity that power had built around him like a shell. She had loved him, genuinely, for a period of time that felt very distant from where she was sitting. She did not tell him that. Not because it would hurt him, it might have helped him, but because it was hers, and she was keeping it. "The business," he said. "The financial restructuring will proceed under the new oversight structure the litigation team is establishing. The Voss instruments are voided. The legitimate portfolio is intact." She paused. "Ferrano understands the new accountability framework. He'll implement it. You should let him. And if I need—" "You won't call me," she said. "That's not available anymore. You have competent people. You'll find more." A pause. "And this time, Damien, you'll actually pay attention to what they're doing." He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man accepting terms he has no ground to contest. She stood. She picked up her coat from the arm of the chair. She stood for a moment in the library of the house she had lived in, managed, protected, and quietly rebuilt several times over, surrounded by unread books and the particular quality of expensive rooms that have been occupied by people too busy for stillness. And she felt the full weight of the leaving, which was different from the leaving 4 nights ago. That leaving had been a reaction. This one was a completion. She put on her coat. "Take care of yourself," she said. Not warmly, not coldly. The way you say something true to someone you are no longer responsible for. She walked out of the library. She walked down the main corridor, past the dining room where 4 nights ago she had folded a napkin and risen from a table and started something that had ended here, in this corridor, with her coat on and her steps even on the marble floor. She pushed open the front door. Outside, the air was cold and clear, the particular cold of a late autumn evening that has lost its afternoon warmth completely. Her car was waiting at the foot of the steps. Not a Moretti vehicle, her own, arranged by Clara's office. The driver was someone she'd hired through the new advisory firm's operational account, the first of many small separations, the first of many things that were entirely, unambiguously hers. She got in. In the weeks that followed, things resolved at the pace of legal and institutional processes, which is to say slowly and incompletely, and with the persistent frustration of watching events that felt urgent being processed by systems designed for deliberation. Henrik Voss was formally charged with civil fraud and conspiracy in the federal district court. The criminal referral related to the government contact, whose identity was eventually established through the document analysis as a mid-level regulatory official who had accepted a cash arrangement in exchange for the promised 6-month investigation delay, was processed by the U.S. Attorney's Office. Castellano entered a cooperation agreement and began the long, corrosive process of trading everything he knew for a reduction in a sentence that was going to cost him years regardless. Luciana Moretti never called Isabella. This did not surprise her. Luciana was a woman whose entire apparatus was organized around the protection of a self-image, and self-images of that particular construction do not survive the act of reaching out to the woman you dismissed for 9 years and asking for understanding. Isabella did not expect it and did not miss it. Some accountings happen in private and leave no external record. Bianca De Luca left the Moretti orbit within 2 weeks of the dinner that had placed her in it. There was no drama in her departure. She was a woman who had miscalculated the nature of the situation she was entering, which was a common mistake and not an unforgivable one. She returned to the social world she'd come from and was spoken of less and less until she was not spoken of at all, which is the usual trajectory of people who are associated with events rather than shaped by them. The Vaughn Global Advisory Group opened its offices on the 42nd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan in the third month after the dinner. The offices were not grand. They were precise, well-lit, organized with the economy of a person who understood that the function of a workspace was to enable work rather than communicate status. The name on the door was clean, unadorned, set in a typeface that was readable and serious. Isabella hired 6 people in the first month. All of them came from recommendations rather than postings, which was how she had always operated, through relationships built over years, through the quality of judgment demonstrated in specific situations, through the slow accumulation of trust that cannot be manufactured or accelerated by someone who is paying attention. Her first 3 clients were institutions she had dealt with on behalf of the Moretti organization and had maintained separate relationships with under her own name, in the careful, patient way of a person who had understood for a long time that she was building something for herself even while she was building it for someone else. She worked long hours. She had always worked long hours. The difference was that the hours now left a mark under her own name. Every document signed, every agreement closed, every relationship built was traceable directly to her, with no organizational name above hers to absorb the attribution. It was a different sensation than she had expected. She'd expected relief. What she found was something more complex, a kind of exposure that sat alongside the satisfaction, the feeling of being visible without the protection of being embedded, which required a recalibration she hadn't fully anticipated. She was good at recalibration. She had practice. On a morning in early spring, 4 months after the dinner that had ended her marriage and begun everything else, Isabella sat at her desk on the 42nd floor with the first light of the season coming through the east-facing windows at the angle that only arrives in the weeks when winter is genuinely finished. The light had a quality to it, not warmth yet, but the specific quality of light that has returned after an absence, that has something to prove about its own persistence. She was reviewing a merger proposal. An international client, a family office based in Singapore whose principal had been referred to her by one of the Voss-era banking contacts who had quietly transferred their relationship to Vaughn Global in the weeks following the fraud disclosure, which was the financial world's version of understanding which way a situation had resolved. The proposal was complex, 7 jurisdictions, 3 regulatory frameworks, the kind of work that required exactly the combination of financial architecture and interpersonal navigation that she had spent 9 years developing in the dark. She read it carefully. She made notes in the margins in the compressed, precise script she'd always used. She identified 3 structural issues and 2 opportunities that the proposal's drafters had not seen. She began writing her response. Her phone was face down on the desk. She had stopped keeping it face up 3 weeks ago, a small adjustment that had produced a measurable decrease in the low-level vigilance she'd been carrying for years. The constant monitoring of incoming information, the always-on quality of a person whose function required perpetual availability. She checked it when she chose to. The world had not collapsed. She was aware, in the way that a person is aware of things they have decided to acknowledge rather than suppress, that what she had survived had left marks that were not yet fully legible to her. There were nights when she woke at 3 a.m. with the specific alertness of a person who has spent years processing threats in her sleep and whose nervous system had not yet received the full update that the threat architecture had changed. There were moments in meetings when she caught herself calculating the exit before she'd finished entering the room, or reading the people around the table for loyalty threat analysis before she'd assessed them for anything more ordinary. These were not problems she was going to solve quickly. She had lived 9 years in a particular kind of environment, and environments leave their residue in ways that don't fully resolve in a season. She was patient with this. She was less patient with herself about many things, but about this she had decided to extend a grace she rarely offered herself, which was the grace of time. Clara called at 10. The Voss civil case has a trial date, 14 months out. Expected. He's going to try to settle before it gets there. He can try. The offer, when it comes, is going to be significant. I know. Isabella looked at the proposal on her desk. We don't settle, Clara. I want the trial record. I want every document in that courtroom public. I want the next person he tries this with to be able to find it with a single search. She paused. That's worth more than the settlement number. A brief silence on the line. All right, Claire said. That's your call. Yes, Isabella said. It is. She ended the call. She turned back to the merger proposal. She picked up her pen. Outside the east-facing window, the spring light had shifted in the time she'd been on the phone, moving through the incremental daily change that accumulates across weeks into seasons, the kind of change that is invisible in any given moment and undeniable across time. She had always noticed this, the quality of light at specific hours, the way it changed the look of surfaces she'd been looking at for years. It was the kind of attention that had nowhere useful to go inside the life she'd been living, and she had tucked it away the way she'd tucked away many things that didn't fit the function. She noticed it now. She let herself notice it. She wrote the first line of her response to the Singapore proposal, and the handwriting was the same compressed, precise script it had always been. And her name at the top of the page was the only name on it, and the light came through the window at its own angle and at its own pace, and the morning continued the way mornings continue when a person has finally, after a very long time, arrived at the place where they were always supposed to be doing the work they were always supposed to be doing, with nothing above them and nothing missing and nothing left to prove to anyone but themselves. She kept writing.